What if you could take an API specification and turn it into a production-ready workflow connector in just a few minutes? In this demo, we'll show exactly how Unodeskly AI Connector Builder does this using the Swagger Petstore API. We start by opening the Unodeskly AI Connector Builder, where we can create a connector from an OpenAPI, Swagger, or Postman specification. For this demonstration, we import the Swagger Petstore OpenAPI JSON. Unodeskly now analyzes the API definition, identifying the server, resources, HTTP methods, endpoints, operation IDs, path and query parameters, request bodies, response schemas, reference models, arrays, enums, and authentication requirements. Instead of manually developing each API operation and mapping every request and response, the connector builder converts the API definition into the Unodeskly connector model. Authentication is an important part of this process. A connector isn't complete simply because its API operations have been discovered. It also needs a proper credential lifecycle. Unodeskly analyzes the security schemes defined in the OpenAPI specification and identifies supported authentication mechanisms such as API keys, bearer authentication, basic authentication, and OAuth 2 where applicable. From this information, the connector builder generates the appropriate credential configuration and connects the credential requirement to the generated workflow nodes. Now we generate the connector. Unodeskly creates the connector definition, authentication configuration, credential templates, schemas, endpoint definitions, and workflow node definitions from the imported API specification. Once generation is complete, we can see the pet store operations. The pet resource includes operations such as add pet, update pet, get pet, delete pet, find pets by status, and find pets by tags. The store resource provides operations such as get inventory, place order, get order, and delete order. The user resource provides operations including create user, get user, update user, delete user, login, and logout. Each API operation has now become a workflow-ready Unodeskly node. Now let's look at credentials. When we open an authenticated generated node, Unodeskly knows which credential type that node requires. The credential picker can display compatible credentials, and if no credential exists, we can select Create New Credential directly from the node configuration. We can enter the required authentication information, test the credential, and securely save it. This means the authentication requirements from the original API specification flow all the way into the actual workflow experience. Next comes certification. Before using the generated connector, Unodeskly can validate it through the connector certification framework. The connector is checked against SDK contracts, authentication and credential requirements, node configuration, schemas, endpoint definitions, testing requirements, error handling, and other connector capabilities. If something fails, the system can identify the failed capability and feed that information into the AI repair process so the connector can be improved and tested again. This creates a generate, test, certify, and repair lifecycle rather than simply generating code and assuming it works. Once the connector passes the required certification, we can publish it to the Unodeskly workflow environment. Now let's use the generated connector inside a real workflow. We open the Unodeskly Workflow Builder and search for our newly generated Petstore connector. Here we can see the generated Petstore operations alongside the other workflow nodes. We select a node such as getPet and drag it directly onto the workflow canvas. The node exposes the parameters discovered from the original API specification, such as the pet ID, and provides the appropriate credential configuration. We can now connect this generated node with other Unodeskly workflow nodes. For example, we can start with a webhook trigger, receive a pet ID, pass that value into the generated getPet node, process the API response, and send the result to another application or service. The generated connector is not separate code, it becomes a native part of the Unodeskly workflow experience. Now let's execute the workflow. Unodeskly resolves the selected credential, prepares the request using the generated endpoint and parameters, sends the request through the integration pipeline, communicates with the Petstore API, receives the response, and makes that response available as workflow data for subsequent nodes. So let's look at what just happened. We started with nothing more than an OpenAPI JSON specification. We didn't manually create every API operation, manually map every request and response, or manually develop each workflow node. Unodeskly analyzed the API, discovered its operations and authentication requirements, generated the connector, generated credential configuration, created schemas and workflow nodes, tested and certified the connector, published it to the workflow builder, and executed the generated node inside a real workflow. This is the core idea behind Unodeskly AI Connector Builder. An API specification can become a usable workflow integration through an automated development lifecycle. The goal isn't simply to generate API code. The goal is to transform an API into a connector that can participate in authentication, credential management, workflow execution, resilience, monitoring, testing, and certification. Imagine taking an API from a SaaS platform, an internal enterprise application, or a partner system, importing its OpenAPI or Swagger specification, and having Unodeskly analyze the API, understand its authentication, generate credentials and operations, create workflow nodes, run certification, identify problems, repair them when possible, and make the connector available inside the workflow builder. That dramatically reduces the repetitive development required to bring new integrations onto an automation platform. Petstore is only the beginning. The same architecture can be applied to complex enterprise APIs with multiple resources, authentication mechanisms, schemas, parameters, and operations. With Unodeskly, the vision is simple: import the API specification, generate the connector, configure the credentials, certify the integration, and start building workflows. From API to workflow, faster, smarter, and with far less manual connector development. AI Connector Builder.